So, we are going to be looking at the Japanese language. So first I would like to establish my credentials. What right do I have to pontificate on the Japanese language? Well, first I would like to acknowledge that I know full well that there are members of the New Sheridan Club that know Japanese better than I do, and that there are much more accomplished linguists in the club than I. The qualifications I have in Japanese are that I studied it for about 5 years, from 2002, pretty seriously. I got AS level Japanese, got a good score in that, and I passed a Japanese exam called Nihongo no Ryoku Shiken Sankyu, which identifies you as having just about reached intermediate standard. After 5 years of hard study, using up most of my spare time, I managed to reach intermediate level. So my main qualification here is my willingness and enthusiasm for standing up in front of a bunch of people and talking about it. Where is Japanese spoken? Unsurprisingly, Japanese is spoken in Japan by 128 million people. Maybe slightly more surprising is the fact that it is not the official language of Japan. Japan doesn't actually have an official language. It's just because it is so much the language that everybody speaks there, there is no real point in making it the official language. Unlike the South Pacific island of Anguilla, which is part of Palau, where Japanese is an official language, but is not spoken by any member of the population of Anguilla, according to the most recent census. I was unable to determine why Japanese is an official language of this little island. Okay, so where did the Japanese language originate from? There is a theory of the Altaic languages, which tries to connect together languages from Turkey across Central Asia through Korea and maybe even to Japan, but that has been discredited. Just a few linguists still subscribe to that. It actually turns out that Japanese is a primary language group all on its own. And so really, the origins of the language are, we don't know. There is one language that's a bit related to Japanese, and that's spoken in the islands to the southwest of Japan, which I visited a few times. Sometimes that's the Ryukyu Islands. They were part of a separate kingdom until they unified with Japan in the 19th century. That's the only language that's related to Japanese. There is thought to be some similarity with Korean, but apparently the languages got more similar as time went on, which is the opposite to what you would expect if they were related. Okay, so what about the language itself? Right, well, as I said in the blurb promoting the talk, I'm going to show how Japanese isn't quite as impenetrable as one might initially imagine. And here we will discuss some of the reasons that that is. Firstly, pronunciation in Japanese is surprisingly simple. There are no tones, unlike in languages like Cantonese or Mandarin Chinese. Many of you will know that in Chinese, how you pronounce the word ma can change its meaning according to whether you say ma, 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 or ma. None of that in Japanese, no tones whatsoever. So that makes pronunciation a lot easier. The pronunciation mostly is pretty similar to English pronunciation. So for native speakers of English, it's quite easy to speak Japanese in an intelligible way, unlike, say, Chinese. Furthermore, all of the words in Japanese either end with a vowel or they end with what is usually transliterated as an N. And so, for example, haiku poetry doesn't rhyme because rhyming in Japanese would sound a bit trite. There are, in fact, only about 100 syllables in Japanese, as compared to several thousand or even over 10,000 in English or Thai, for example. So in terms of the number of sounds that you have to train your mouth to make, it's pretty straightforward. There are three slightly tricky things. you've got the glottal stop, as the linguists call it, which is the in bottle in Cockney. And that is used in Japanese and makes the difference in meaning between two words. So the Japanese word for stamp is kite, with a glottal stop with the t. And if you say kite, then that's a completely different word, which I don't actually know what it means, if it means anything. Another interesting thing with Japanese is that in English, if you say path and path, that's two different accents. I'm a bit linguistically mixed up because I had an itinerant childhood, so I sometimes say path, sometimes I say path, short A, long A. In Japanese, the length of a vowel actually changes the meaning of the word. You have single length and double length. I learned this the hard way when I was having a conversation at a Japanese conversation club, and I was talking in Japanese, and she said, "What are you going to do in Japan?" And I wanted to say sightseeing, and I said, "Kanko." And she gave me a puzzled look. And I think, "Kanko?" Puzzled look. "Kanko." Oh, Kanko. Increase the length of the vowel. It's not a dialect thing. It's not an accent thing. It actually changes the meaning of the word. So, yeah, that's just something you need to remember. It's not actually difficult to pronounce. Something
what
that
does
is...
Kanko mean?
What?
What are the short vowels?
I've no idea. I think from the puzzled look, it either meant something that's got nothing to do with any kind of holiday activity, might be some species of insect or something.
That's very much like Finnish as well.
Oh, right, yeah. So, yeah, then you've got something that is a source of some hilarity among, say, working men's club comedians or something, with the mixing up of the L and the R that you get among Japanese and other speakers of East Asian languages. That's because there is neither an L nor an R in Japanese or indeed Chinese, and instead there is another syllable or another sound which is somewhere between an R, an L and a D. And I've never managed to master it, but it's something like yi. And so when Japanese people are speaking English, they're like using the sounds, these mouth shapes that they've learnt as in their childhood to try and imitate the English sounds, and the L and the R both get sort of put into this l sound, and so they tend to mix up flight and fright, for example, and to much hilarity of those who are unenlightened. For me, however, these sort of Japlish jokes that you sometimes see in internet memes and so forth stopped seeming so funny when I realised that the mistakes I was making as I was learning Japanese would be at least 10 times more hilarious and appalling than the Japanese misuses of English that you see in the gags. Right, so another aspect of Japanese that makes it easy to learn, at least when you're starting off, is that it's an extremely regular language. And I speak as somebody who was a computer programmer. It's pretty much as regular as a computer programming language. Like, you have a rule, it always behaves like that. Sometimes the rules are a bit complicated, but they happen regularly. There are only 3 irregular verbs in the entire language. Compare that to something like Latin, where you get books of 500 irregular Latin verbs. Even those are only very slightly irregular. So that makes learning grammatical patterns a lot more straightforward and indeed enjoyable. Furthermore, Japanese has only got 2 tenses. Just 2. I don't know how many there are in English or French, but there are far too many, at least from the point of view of the Japanese, and from my point of view when I was learning French. They, at a stretch, you might say they have 4, because you've kind of got an ending where you can say this is a sort of continuous thing happening. But it's just past and non-past are the 2 tenses that you have to learn. And furthermore, there are no genders. Nothing like in German. Are there genders in Finnish, Priya?
18.
Yeah, 32 declensions.
Right.
Genders, sometimes.
Genders.
Not really. Yeah.
Right, yeah. So in contrast to a language like Finnish, much more straightforward when it comes to things like genders. So now let's take a look at some of the less easy bits of the language. So the vocabulary is quite easy to pronounce. The challenge comes from the fact that the words generally bear absolutely no relation to English. Unsurprisingly, being a completely unrelated language. So in French, you have the word for butter is beurre, which isn't too unlike butter. German, sugar, Zucker. Japanese, you don't get those helping hands to kind of remind you what the word might be. So learning vocabulary takes some more effort. Furthermore, Japanese language tends to have more specific words for things, which is actually pretty interesting. A good example of that is in families. So in English we have the word, say, sister. So this is my sister. In Japanese, this is your sister. In Japanese, however, you distinguish between your own sister and somebody else's sister, because we're going to talk about respect language shortly, but you have to exalt the other person and humble yourself. So you have an exalting word for sister and then a humbling word for sister. And then furthermore, status is also very important in Japanese culture. So you have the idea of an older sister and a younger sister, and an older brother and a younger brother, completely different words for the two. So extra bits of vocabulary to, one, learn, and two, learn how to use on the fly in conversation. So that's kind of fun. Something else that makes it less easy, but in my humble opinion, very interesting, is not that the grammar is so much difficult as very different. So the grammatical structure of the language is just completely different from English, say English, French, German. You can see relationships between the grammar. In Japanese, the grammar is just different. For example, the language doesn't really make much use of pronouns, if at all. So if somebody's introducing themselves, if you sort of type, "I am Mr. Tanaka," into Google Translate, it will say the translation is, "Watashi wa Tanaka-san desu." But actually, a Japanese person would probably just say Tanaka desu. They wouldn't say the "watashi wa" is kind of a literal translation of, well, not really, but "I am." But it's more of a, well, as for me, is the kind of meaning that would sort of get translated in Google Translate, but doesn't really convey what would happen in real life. There's a theory that the reason that Japanese doesn't really use pronouns very much is that Japanese people traditionally lived in houses that were optimized for very hot weather, and so had flimsy walls and paper screens and so forth, so that it was very easy to overhear what other people were saying. So it was a good idea to speak softly and be kind of vague about who you might be talking about. I'm not sure if that's got any credibility, but it's an interesting theory. I know that an esteemed member of the New Sheridan Club wrote a book all about the little words at and the. I've actually read it from cover to cover with great interest. And Japanese doesn't have these definite and indefinite articles, which cause speakers of languages that do not use these grammatical constructions great confusion. In Japanese, there's no plurals and there's no a or the. So that takes a bit of getting used to, but actually they're more absences rather than presence, so you don't really have to worry. It's something that you don't have to worry about. Something you do have to worry about, though, is that Japanese, like Chinese in fact, uses something called counters. So you don't say, for example, 2 books. You say 2 volumes of book, which would be literally ni is 2, satsu is volume, no hon, hon is book. So ni satsu no hon is 2 books, but it's literally 2 volumes of book. And these counters vary depending on the thing that you're talking about. So, for example, if you're talking about badgers, so fairly small animals, then the counter is hiki. So you have ni hiki no anaguma. Anaguma is badger. It's actually one of the first Japanese words I learnt. Bizarrely. The story. Actually, the reason that I started learning Japanese, I meant to talk about this at the beginning of the session, was that my wife had a job. My wife and I went to Japan, and my wife really took to the Japanese characters, which we're going to look at shortly. And she had a job where half the time she was really busy, and the rest of the time she didn't have anything at all to do. So she started studying these characters because she just liked them like pictures, and at work. And after doing this for about a year, she decided that she wanted to start going to Japanese lessons. So she said to me, "Tim, I'm going to start going to Japanese lessons." You don't have to come if you don't want to. I was like, right, I think I'll be going to Japanese lessons then. But it turned out that I got on pretty well with it, and I liked it because I like the traditional Japanese culture.
So you could say she badgered you.
Yes.
Very
Yes.
well.
Yay.
Yeah.
Resigned to that.
I'm sorry, was that the punchline?
Yeah. No, it wasn't. I didn't think of that. But next time I give this talk, I will ensure that I do. So, yeah, we did also around the same time learn the Japanese word for crocodile, which is wani, which I did have course to use when we went to a crocodile farm in one of the 5 hells that they have in a particular tourist spot in Japan. And then for machines, they're dai. So 2 bicycles is ni dai no jitensha. So you don't have to learn genders, but you do have to learn what counter to use with a particular type of word. And you get funny things like rabbits count as birds, which is a bit strange.
How many variations of the counting word are there?
Oh, I've no idea.
One of those restricted number of the counting.
Well, it's probably in the dozens, I would imagine. And another fun thing, also relating to numbers, is that in the numbers 1 to 10, Japanese distinguishes between a number of things and the abstract number. So you kind of got futatsu means 2 things, and then you don't use the counter, but ni is the abstract number 2. So you have to get used to knowing 2 words, in fact sometimes more than 2 words for a number, which is kind of fun and interesting rather than just painful like learning French genders. So because of this simplicity in grammar compared to a language like Old English, which I happen to know that Clayton knows.
I can remember 1 or 2 words.
Yeah.
What?
A lot of the study is sort of learning and getting the hang of like a phrase which is like a verb conjugation, but it's pretty much a pattern that you can then pour words into. So I learnt the expression to say I have the experience of doing something just off a Japanese friend in a pub. She said, oh yeah, you just say, like if I've been to Japan is Nihon ni ita koto ga arimasu. And you can kind of, it's pretty easy to convert that into like any other experience. And like learning Japanese, a lot of the effort, as well as learning the vocabulary and the writing system, which we'll come on to, is learning these like really more like phrases rather than sort of grammatical gymnastics that you might have to do in Finnish, for example. So there's no like really sort of in-depth discussions about whether this is all the different types of parts of speech, which I don't actually know because I studied Japanese and so didn't learn them. But you've got kind of you've got like all these different cases in Finnish and also in German, genitive and things like that. I did do Latin for 2 years, and didn't really get on with it. Kind of a handy feature, a bit like if you've anyone who knows done any computer programming, some like computer languages. Stuart's nodding there. You kind of get little idioms which are handy for expressing something that you often express. And Japanese does this really well. 2 of my favourites are ways of conjugating verbs in a very regular way. One that means let's do something, which is you just stick or at the end. And so iku is to go, and ikor is let's go. So you can just use one word to say let's go, which is pretty good. And to say that you want to do something, you can say if you want to say I can read, say something writing's big enough, instead of saying yomelu, you can say you can say yomeru. You just change the pronunciation from an e to an e or something, and it changes it from doing to having the ability to do. So quite a very simple idiom for expressing something rather different. Right. Another bit of different grammar is that in French, adjectives have to agree with the noun. In Japanese, they have a tense. So if something is red, it's akai, but if it was red, then it's akata. So that's a bit of fun there. And I've nattered so long for one slide, despite my promise of being a dynamic presentation, that it has gone on sleep. Okay, let's look at a Japanese sentence. So this means Mr. Tanaka reads a book. Tanaka-san wa hon o yomimasu. So let's decompose this. So Tanaka-san, Mr. Tanaka reads a book. So this bit here, so Tanaka is the name of the person. San is the honorific, which is generally translated as Mr. or Mrs., but it's really just a suffix that you use with the name of anybody who isn't yourself or close family, or anybody else that you have to humble yourself with. You always put a san on the end. So I liken it actually more to using a capital letter at the start of somebody's name, which is something you do out of politeness. So Tanaka-san, and then the wa kind of is, as for Mr. Tanaka. And then hon o, so hon is book, and the o means this is the object of the sentence. And this is how Japanese sentences are constructed. They're a bit like Lego bricks. So you've got these things, this wa and this o are what are called particles. And these are the grammatical glue that bind a sentence together. What you have is a thing followed by a particle that indicates its role in the sentence. So Tanaka-san wa, that means, right, as for Mr. Tanaka, so this is the thing we're talking about here. Ho, book, this is the object of the sentence. And then we have the verb, yomimasu. So he is reading, Mr. Tanaka is reading a book. And this ending here is a fairly polite form of the verb. So this is a really big deal in Japanese. No complex grammar. Very complex when it comes, well, quite a lot of hierarchy and who has status and who you should be polite to. So the verb typically goes at the end in a Japanese sentence, maybe even always goes at the end. And so to make it negative, instead of saying yomimasu, you say yomimasen. So you don't know until somebody's got right to the end of a sentence whether it's positive or negative. And if you want to turn it into a question, you just stick cat on the end, a bit like sticking est que on the front of a French sentence, which makes it a question. Priya?
Which is like finish.
Yeah?
You put a k or ko at the end of a verb, which you put at the beginning of the sentence.
Ah, you put it at the beginning of the sentence.
Yeah.
So you know from the start that it's a question,
Yes.
whereas in Japanese, somebody could be wittering on, and you've kind of lost, you stop paying attention, and they say cat, and you go, oh my goodness, I've got to answer
So
something.
it's different effect. Yeah.
Yes. So you don't know whether it's positive, negative, or a question until they got right to the end of the sentence. So look out. Yeah, here we've talked about being able to do something, and let's do it. So what I really liked about studying Japanese was the cultural insight. And there's quite a lot to do with respect and hierarchy. And where I pretty much gave up on Japanese is the large area of study called Kego, which is respect speech, where not only are there different conjugations, but actually different words that you use to indicate respect. So, for example, once I went into a hotel and asked them if they had any rooms, and he said, honjitsu arimasen. And I didn't know what honjitsu meant, so I went and looked it up, and it means today, but it's a respectful way of saying today instead of kyo, which is the normal way of saying today. And since then I noticed on aeroplane announcements they use honjitsu. So even for quite ordinary things, Japanese has got special polite words. We kind of do the same thing in English. There is like a formal way of speaking, less formal way of speaking. In Japanese they sort of take it to another level, and it's much more kind of encoded and required. Another fun thing about Kego is it's not just changing the way that you speak, but it's very important that, well, it is just the grammatical way of doing it, that you exalt the person that you're talking to and humble yourself. I've even read that in Japanese, when you talk about your children, you're supposed to refer to my stupid son, which I think could get you in a lot of trouble in this country. And if you're a teacher, typically you may, if you've done any martial arts, you may have called your martial arts teacher sensei, which is indeed the Japanese word for teacher. But if you yourself are a teacher, or your mother's a teacher, you refer to them as being a kyoshi, which is a humble way of saying that you're a teacher. If you say sensei, then you're exalting yourself, which is the sort of etiquette equivalent of putting your knife in your mouth and scratching your head with a fork. Right. sort of a bit related to that is that in the Japanese language in general, I kind of noticed that there was quite a lot of use of directions. Like words, say, if you're comparing one thing with another, the words that you use to do that, you might say Canada, if you want to say Canada is colder than France, you say Canada no hou ga Fransu yori samui desu. Samui means cold. So no hou and the yori are both directional words. So there's more use of directions than you have in English. So that's kind of an observation that I made. There are plenty of dialects in Japanese, but that, like just standard Japanese was hard enough to learn, so I never learned any kind of Japanese dialect. As we've already discussed, this doesn't manifest itself in different ways of pronouncing things, which are pretty set. Apparently it's more to do with sticking endings on the end of sentences or using different words for things. But really I don't know much about that. You've also got this kind of implicitness. A lot of communication in Japanese is done more through implication, being obvious from context. I remember in my first Japanese year of studying Japanese, the teacher would often say, if it's obvious, then you don't need to say it. So if you are talking about somebody's birthday, you might just say, how was birthday, rather than how was your birthday. Although, in actual fact, although you don't use pronouns in Japanese, instead a way of signalling whether you're talking about yourself or the other person is that you stick an honorific in front of it. So you might talk about otanjobi, means honourable birthday, and if you're talking about an honourable birthday, then it's obviously not your own, because you must humble yourself. It must be the birthday of the other person. And even something like the weather, if you're asking somebody about the weather on their holiday, you'll say otenki, tenki being weather, honourable weather. A bit analogous to genders is that with this honorific or, sometimes you have go instead, and you just have to learn which words get or and which words get go. So that's a bit of a pain. But fortunately, I never got advanced enough in Japanese really to have to worry about that. Okay, so now let's take a look at the writing system. So here we have a sentence written in Japanese, which is that Yukiko-san drank beer on a JR train. JR is the Japanese National Railway Company. Can't have a new Sheridan Club talk without mentioning trains. Or beer, for that matter. Yeah. Nothing about Nazis in this one. So here we have some Roman script, JR. So that's script number 1. Keep count. Here we have these bits of grammatical glue, the no, de, and o. And we also have the this wa here, and we've got this honorific here. So this is a script called hiragana. Oh, and we've also got the verb ending here, mimashita. So that's called hiragana. That's script number 2. Then here we've got biru. This is the Japanese word for beer, derived from the Dutch bier. The Dutch was the only country that had contact with Japan for about 200 years through a port in Nagasaki, an island just off Nagasaki. Okay, so that's script number 3. And then you have the real bad boys, the kanji, the imported Chinese characters. So that is giving the name, Yukiko, densha, the train, electric vehicle, and the verb to drink, there. So that is 4 scripts, and you have to, so let's take a look at each of these in more detail. 4 scripts. So Roman characters are the ones that appear least frequently. Here's a screenshot from a Japanese railway company website, and this is a railway station that I used when I was working in Japan for a few weeks, and this stands for Yokosuka Research Park, and really Roman characters are only used for things like brand names and kind of utility, where you've got this KK here, it's just some way of indicating a station name, and then just some initials which are actually spelled out here in hiragana. So knowing Roman characters isn't really much use in Japan apart from seeing the odd brand name. The hiragana, however, are used all over the place. The hiragana were originally used by women because they were not permitted to use the Chinese characters, and they originated as very quick ways of writing the Chinese characters, which were imported around the, history is vague, but pre-10th century they were imported from China, and so they've sort of branched off. And this is a completely phonetic alphabet. So here's a table, and you've got the a, I, U, E, O, ka, ki, ku, ke, ko. This is like lesson 1 in Japanese, is learning these symbols and how to write them and how to pronounce them. Takes a day or two to learn them, and these are used for grammatical glue and verb endings. These were necessary in Japanese because the Chinese characters imported from China, Chinese language doesn't operate in the same way the Japanese does, and so really these were needed for phonetic bits of the Kriya.
Are there patterns for the different vowels and how they're written?
No.
Okay.
You just have to learn it.
Memorise.
Although we will come on to something that is a bit of a pattern on the next slide. So thank you for that question. Hold that thought. Yeah, so they have a bit of a. They're considered to be a bit feminine, which is no bad thing. It is actually my favourite Japanese script. So when it comes to being regular in terms of how it's pronounced, is that you've got these 2 dashes, and if you put the 2 dashes, then it changes the sound. For example, from he to bi, so it makes it voiced, and a ka goes to ga, for example. So very logical and regular. And just for the syllables that begin with H, there's a circle, and if you put a circle next to one of the syllables that starts with an H, then it goes from ho to po, or hu to pu, and he to pi, etc. So that is a very regular way of changing the pronunciation. Another way of changing the pronunciation is sticking U after a ki to say things like Q. So this is, if you totted up the number of syllables, then you'd find that there weren't quite 100 or so. The balance is made up from combining ki and U and ki and your, so you get cure, Q, things like that. So, and that's the totality of it. So really it is only a few days' work to memorise them. Then there's katakana.
For some of us, maybe.
Katakana is the one bit of Japanese that's actually worth learning if you're going there on holiday. Because it's used for writing foreign words, and they're not all derived from English. I remember being told that the Japanese word for a questionnaire was enquête. I was like, well, that doesn't sound like anything in English, but it's actually from the French enquête, which means questionnaire. So exactly the same sounds, but these are used for emphasis and mainly for writing imported words, of which there are a lot. And once you get used to the way that imported words are converted into Japanese, it's actually great fun walking around the streets in Japan being able to read the katakana. Here's an example, can of beer. And this says non-alcohol. This is alcohol-free beer. As you know, I'm not a drinking man. And this says dolai zero. So this is kind of, you can see that katakana is actually used quite a lot. Right, now Chinese characters. Whoops, skipped a slide there. So Chinese characters imported to Japan. Here we've got, let's take a look at how they might have been derived. So here we've got a very simple picture of a tree, kind of pine tree, the most common kind of tree in Japan. And you can kind of see how that would get rendered like this. So that's the Japanese character for tree. This is the Japanese character for forest, 2 trees. And this is the Japanese character for forest. So that's wood, and that's forest. So forest is 3 trees. So 2 trees wood, 3 trees forest. Picture of the sun. So that might get stylized like that and become the Japanese character for sun. So this appears in Nihon, the Japanese word for Japan. Also means day. And here's the moon, and you can see how that might modify into the Japanese word for moon and month. So it's starting to look even slightly childish in its naivety. Or so I thought. So here we've got sun and moon. Put them together, it means bright. Oh, this is good. Bright. Put bright with day. Bright day, tomorrow. How optimistic. So then, you swap round sun and moon. So you've got moon, sun in the same character. You put a line underneath it. What does it mean? Gallbladder. So, and not only does it mean gallbladder, so this is from my learner's Japanese dictionary, It can also mean courage, pluck, nerve, depending on the context. And in Chinese, when you use Chinese characters, one character has one way of saying it. So Chinese character for to go, it's always pronounced chu. In Japanese, here we've just got 4 different ways of pronouncing that character. And so if you see a Japanese character written down, you don't actually know how to pronounce it. So one way of learning a language if you're staying somewhere is like going around reading the street signs, seeing what something says. You can't do that in Japanese because you've got no idea how to pronounce it. So that's kind of fun. Another thing that happens with the characters is that when they get kind of munged together into a single character to mean something more complex, they also change shape, which is actually kind of useful. So here we've got the character for water. That is the version of water that goes into a character. So it's called a radical. They're called radicals. And if you combine water with old and moon, then it means lake. And if you've got the character for person, that's how it's rendered if you're putting person into a character. And then when you've got person and mountain, it means hermit, which is rather charming. So, when you start learning these characters in bulk, like learning 1 or 2 is quite easy and it's kind of fun. When you start learning them in bulk, it starts to get kind of challenging. So here we've got 2 characters, and one means open and one means close. How on earth are you supposed to remember which is which? Japanese school children do it by writing them out thousands and thousands of times, and it works. So Japan has got higher levels of literacy than the UK. So that's the way around it is. Right, and Japanese is also quite persnickety about exactly how you draw the character. So this is actually something that was one of the Japanese exams I did. This is the character for winter, fuyu. And notice these 2 dashes here. You must write them in that top left to bottom right sloping direction. That is wrong. And there are exams that test you on this sort of thing. And there are exams that test you on the order. Also in these exams, you get tested on the exact order that you write the strokes in for the character. My wife did some of these, and they'll show you a stroke in one of the characters and say, right, which stroke order number is that? So you have to learn that kind of thing. So this is where it gets challenging. So, why bother with such a clunky writing system which doesn't even tell you how to say things? The main reason is that kanji, as they are called, is very deeply embedded in Japanese culture, and it's very important to the Japanese. Calligraphy is considered the highest form of art. And the ability to write a lot of different kanji is a mark of being well educated. This is the character for alcohol, and the meaning of this goes straight into my mind because I know it. Once you know a character, and this is, I think, another reason for using kanji, is that they have greater immediacy than words written down in Roman characters, say. The meaning, once you know them, the meaning goes into your mind more directly. I particularly remember this one because I saw a young mum with like booze written on her t-shirt. Okay. So this is water coming out of the side here, and this is like a rice press for making sake. Pretty neat. Okay. Sometimes people ask me about how Japanese people enter the writing system on their computer. So actually what happens is people tend to use Roman-style keyboards with some extra keys for changing between the mode of entry, whether it's going to be Roman characters, hiragana, katakana, or kanji. And then people actually type stuff in phonetically, like this. So this is poor guy. And then the computer gives you a list of possible options for which set of kanji you want to enter. And you can pick one of those. That means off-campus learning.
So how does touch typing work? I mean, words per minute with this kind of system?
I don't know. No idea, but they seem to do okay. It also does sort of auto-completion, but it's not really like touch typing in English, say, because you do have to kind of type it in and then pick things from the drop-down menu. But you see people on trains tapping things. I remember pre-smartphone, people just using the keypads on their mobile phones, choosing things from drop-down menus and like tapping out. It's actually emails rather than texts that they use in Japan. But it was once you get the hang of it, it's pretty quick. And of course, using kanji is a pretty dense, intense form of communication. you can see from this picture, unsurprisingly, Japanese typewriters never really caught on. Because you need a matrix of, a normal, typically educated Japanese person, like high school educated, is expected to know about 2,000 characters. You explicitly learn about 1,000 in school, and then you're expected to pick up the other 1,000. And you need about 2,000 to read a newspaper, so a typewriter, you'd need about 2,000 characters, so it's just not practical. This is apparently one of the reasons the Japanese invented the fax machine, was so that it was easy to send written communication around.
Which they still use quite a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, yes, they do. In fact, well, this is my. I won't go into fax machines because it's actually part of my professional expertise. I could do a whole other session on fax machines, but that probably wouldn't be that interesting. I can't resist but telling you the first fax machine, I saw it in a museum in Bradford, came out in the 19th century. It was this great big wooden box, Victorian thing. Anyway, to wrap up, is the game worth a candle? Is learning Japanese worth all the trouble that it takes to learn it? And I think probably from a pure business economic point of view, not really, because you've got maybe in the 1970s, 1980s, but the Japanese economy has been stagnating for a long time. The real business is in China nowadays, and so I speak tolerable Japanese. I've only used it a few times, and I work in sales, international sales. Haven't really used Japanese all that much. It was useful, but it was just like a sort of, yeah, that's handy, not, oh gosh, yes, we've got to have you doing this kind of thing. To my mind, the real reason for learning Japanese is the same as it is for many languages, is that it enables you to live in two worlds rather than one. So the experiences that I've had from being able to talk to people, albeit in a fairly simple way, in Japanese, has given me opportunities that I just would not have otherwise had. So, thank you for listening. Any questions?
Did the Japanese language go through developmental stages like Middle English and Old English and so on?
I believe so. I do know somebody who studied Japanese academically, and he told me that he liked medieval Japanese. I'm kind of quite proud of being able to say, could I have the bill, please? So going to medieval Japanese.
Is it not risky to not speak well Japanese, so you could do so many mistakes for what you mentioned before of respectful, not respectful, so maybe it's better not to say anything because so much probably mistaken that, normally, okay, they accept that you don't know, but...
There's a surprising amount to unpack in that question, actually, so you do raise a good point there. So I think first point there is that when you're first learning Japanese, you learn a fairly polite form. So the form I was using in most of those examples it's called the mass form, and that's a fairly polite way of speaking, what you'd use to speak to your maiden aunt, for example, or your grandmother. A sort of fairly respectful way of speaking. So that kind of protects you from the worst forms of worst mistakes that you might make. The second point there is that the Japanese actually kind of expect people like me to not speak Japanese terribly well, and actually they can get, it's not just forgive you, they're actually more reassured by it. They're actually a bit defensive of the Japanese language, and kind of, there's, more historically, there was this sort of xenophobia that foreigners couldn't possibly learn Japanese, and I can get the Second World War in here, because one reason that the Americans won the Battle of Midway was that the Japanese couldn't believe that anyone could understand Japanese, so they didn't put as much effort into their ciphering, and the Americans managed to crack the Japanese cipher, but the Japanese never managed to crack the American ciphers, which included Navajo code talking, which was an amazing innovation. Apparently when people start to get really good at Japanese, some people, not all Japanese by any means, but there can be a bit of a tendency for them to get a bit, oh gosh, they're encroaching on our territory kind of thing. I did notice that when my Japanese was at its peak, people like cashiers stopped saying, oh, you're good at Japanese, which they started to do again more recently since it's gone rusty. Essence.
Just a couple of observations. I'm surprised you didn't have this translation of Mr. Tanaki won't be joining us for the rest of his life. No? Die Hard, anybody? No? The other one, I did have an interview many years ago with a company called Ito, which is I don't know if it's still going, it was a trading company like Mitsubishi in London, and I mean, I can see it now, the whole panel of these Japanese, clearly I think you had to speak some Japanese to have any chance of getting a job with them. Obviously I didn't go. And the other one is, I mean, they're quite, Japanese are quite conscious of the fact that people can't pronounce their, I mean, the Toyota Motor Company is actually owned by the Toyota family, Toyoda, but they actually changed the name of the company so that it's not mispronounced, which I've always found.
Toyota.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
That's the family that well, still owns the company as far as I know. Well, certainly Toyota's on the board, but that's
Same with
the name
Mazda.
of the company was changed.
So Mazda is actually Matsuda,
Yeah.
which is pine tree field, but it's easier to say to Western tongue as Mazda.
Yeah. But it's, I mean, you'll call it Toyota because that's why they changed.
Yeah. Although that's only actually a slight change because when you glue two words together in Japanese, frequently the first consonant of the second word goes from ta to d or k to g. So that happens
It's
quite
much easier for English people to pronounce Toyota
Yeah.
as opposed to Toyota.
Yeah.
Yeah, just quickly, I'm curious to know. So English has suffered some reductions. So, for example, isn't it has become in it. So is that
Some people.
Some people, yeah.
Yeah.
Not here, I might add. Not here, I might add. But is Japanese experiencing the same problem where you have a team aware where you get people crushing and swapping out words to become new words?
Well, I don't know whether that's a problem. I'd call that linguistic diversity in Japan. So, if you like a Westerner, ask a Japanese friend, like what's some Japanese slang? They'll swear blind that there's no slang in Japanese or any rude words. It's like, no, there obviously are. And there's even a book on rude Japanese, which I haven't read, obviously. Apparently there's a lot of slangy Japanese out there, but I've never got to the level where I'd start learning it. Also, so an interesting thing with Japanese is that there's actually a lot of different ways of speaking. Another Second World War story I like is of an American GI stationed there after the invasion. He shouted something at somebody on the street in Japanese, and all the people around him knew the kind of women that he'd learned Japanese off of. You get like very specific groups of people will have different ways of talking. But when it comes to contracting things, I don't specifically know. But probably
it's a very, very common thing. Japanese teenagers, exactly like it is here. They contract very long.
So it exists then?
It does, yeah. And teachers will say that they can't actually understand students talking to each other.
I'm not saying it's a problem. I'm just curious.
No, so it happens as well because you get very, as you know, you get very, very long Japanese words, some Japanese expressions, and you just take all the non-essential bits out of those.
Chairman.
Talking of rude Japanese, how easy is it to swear? And do they have a wonderful use of euphemisms such as we have? So, you'd say just coarse language. But if you use a really vulgar phrase, it's just a euphemism. That's almost worse. Do the Japanese have anything like that?
Undoubtedly, I would imagine. But I've never got up to the level where I'd find out. But I would be very surprised if they didn't.
Yes.
But it's hard enough just learning how to ask.
The polite way of speaking. Yes.
They generally don't want to teach you.
Yeah,
it's quite hard to get swear words.
Yeah.
Do they actually import foreign words related? Like in German, they import a lot of English words that they just use.
Oh no, so just as Japanese are very good at importing technology and making it their own, it's like a cultural knack. a sort of synergy between like sort of producing and then perfecting. The Japanese have got a knack of importing overseas words and then converting them into sort of making them their own, so they're still written in katakana. But for example, the word glass, as in something you drink out of, and what you have in a window, there's actually two different ways of pronouncing. One's galasu and the other's garasu. I can't remember which way around it is. But yeah, because of not being able to run consonants into each other, the words like television is terebi. So sometimes, well, I'd say quite often, an imported word is unrecognisable. I remember reading a book about learning languages in general, and you said, "Look at these words. Can you guess what language Can you guess what they mean in their language?" It's like, "Well, no." And then he said, "It's Japanese." I was like, "Well, I'm supposed to know a bit of Japanese, but I don't recognise these at all." Yeah. So yeah, they changed them quite considerably. Unless it's a word like, if it's a word that consists of multiple consonant vowel syllables, like Canada, then that goes into Japanese quite easily. But words like France, not so much, which is Fulansu.
Are there significant ethnic variations, like the Ainu people?
Oh yes, yeah. Well, the Ryukyu and Ainu, I think they've got their own languages, and I think they've had some influence on Japanese, and then you get the regional dialects as well, which people tend to be quite proud of.
Any more questions? Or? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who's watching at home. Hope you've enjoyed it and the technology worked. See you next time.